Hi people, it's Archivist here, and today I'm going to be reviewing Middle-earth: Shadow of War. And this is going to be an interesting one because this is one of the most controversial games of the year. For those of you not aware, this game has had this rather troublesome implementation of microtransactions, which is to say that after spending a lot of money on the game, you then can, if you choose, spend real money in the game to get some bonuses, but we will come to that in some detail. But first of all, having played the game through now, I want to do a standard review of it first. And so let's talk about the story, which isn't particularly strong, but then again, it's not bad. You know, it's an open world game, and I'm usually very forgiving of an open world game for not having, I guess you could say, an impactful story or a story that I'm going to remember. For example, when I tried to recall the Shadow of Mordor storyline, I couldn't remember it. I genuinely could not remember the plot points. And, well, first of all, before I go any further here, I will be talking about spoilers potentially. So if you don't want any spoilers, please click away. And also, I think I'm going to find something very similar in Shadow of War where I'm going to forget the characters because, I mean, they're well voice acted. They have narrative arcs. They fit well within the universe, but they're not particularly memorable because they fit such standard archetypes. It's just so standard, right? They are all very serious, they're all very one note, and all the story devices are pretty much just standard tropes. Basically, nothing stands out. It's got lots of quality. You probably will enjoy it to some extent, but it doesn't really break the mold to any extent. It's just not the focus of the game. And I don't hold it against the game either, because in all honesty, the story is not the selling point of this game. It's not been part of the marketing, and there's a good reason for that really. It isn't the best part about it. However, there are still some interesting ideas in this. They expand upon some of the lore that already exists from Tolkien. For example, Shelob is now a woman for some reason. I don't want to insult that idea because it's actually quite creative, and it's much better than if we'd been talking to a giant spider where you wouldn't have got the same facial expressions. And you've got this exploration of Celebrimbor and Talion, who are one Wraith Lord character. And this is where we're going to hit spoiler territory for sure. What you'll find is at the end of the main story, basically Celebrimbor and Talion have a falling out, they break apart, and Talion then goes off on his own, whereas Celebrimbor is merged with Sauron, which was actually, I thought, pretty a bold idea because it changes how you play the game, or not how you play the game, how you see the game and the context of the game. So whereas in the first part of the story, where you're playing through any mission, you're doing anything, what you'll find is that Celebrimbor will comment on a lot of stuff. But once that story pivot comes into play, it changes so that it's just Talion seeing it. And whereas before, if you did any kind of Wraith activity, it would be Celebrimbor, it then changes into a sort of Wraith version of Talion. And I thought that was quite a bold move to take, and must have taken some time to double up on some of the animations. Other than that point, other than that particular aspect to the story, I'm not sure how much I remember. Other than the Balrog fight, that's pretty cool. In fact, I just don't think they should have shown that before the game came out, because when I did it, I thought it was pretty awesome and it would have been a nice surprise. In fact, I'd go as far as to say, in terms of the story missions, the Balrog fight is the highlight. I think it is. It's a good fight. It makes sense that you need to have the aid of this tree spirit in order to defeat it, and yeah, that was a solid storyline. Everything else I'll probably forget. In fact, I can't remember some of the characters' names, so I'm a little afraid to reference them. Although the inclusion of the Nazgul was very good, but again, that's partially because I think they're a very cool design. More so than them being a strong narrative point, and also because the fights of them were very well done and they changed the pace up from the typical orc fights. So ultimately the story is pretty decent for an open world game, but then again, it is an open world game. This genre has to contend with the duality of presenting a linear story against the open world nature of a sandbox. They are two intrinsically different ideas, and you never really get the same quality of storytelling out of an open world game that you do out of something that's more linear, more focused. and it's fine. It's something I accept and something that I'm not going to hold against the game. But let's get onto the gameplay, because I can absolutely sing the praises of the gameplay in Shadow of War. It is fantastic. In terms of character action games where it's mostly melee focused combats, this is industry leading, potentially the best system I've ever seen in this kind of game. It's based around combos, rhythm, understanding your enemies, and leveling up in terms of just raw power and your skills and your armor even. So let's try and tackle those one at a time if I even can. So combat in terms of combos is essentially you string together very basic attacks, and then as you build up might, you can unleash more powerful attacks. It might be an instant execution, it might be an AoE attack, things that will give you a substantial advantage in combat. And then you can use skills to upgrade them, which then allows them to become more advanced. So for example, the execution move can then be used to string a second execution to an enemy, and it just basically explodes in terms of its complexity. And the thing about the game is it actually starts off with a very basic combat system, so without any of the upgrades in place, it's very simple and very basic. And I can imagine that someone who may not have a lot of time to play the game may start playing it, see the combat system and think, it's a little bit basic, to be honest, a little bit underwhelming, I don't know what everyone's talking about. Trust me when I say you do have to get into the game and invest a lot of skills into the game before the combat really opens up. At the beginning, you're pretty much just spamming the X or square button in order to build up attacks, but you don't get your combo attacks, so it's kind of bland. Once you start getting things like execution, which I recommend unlocking as fast as you possibly can, it makes the combat so much more enjoyable. And you have to consider what attacks you're using against which enemies. So if you have a shielded opponent, you have to vault over their head and attack them in the back. If it's a raged opponent, you just have to be aware that they will throw arrows or spears at you while they're away, so it's good to take them out. If they're just a standard grunt, then use them for cannon fodder, build up your combos off them. If you get the larger ogre-like enemies, you just have to be very aware of their heavy attacks, so you can stun them or go between their legs and hit them in the back. If you've got berserkers, you have to know you can't do a head-on attack, you have to stun them first. As you can see, it's quite complex, and you can get into battles where you're surrounded by every type of enemy, and it can be a little bit of a brain scramble when you're trying to think, okay, I can attack this guy head on, but I have to go over this guy's head, and I have to stun this one, I have to shoot this one from a distance. But that's what makes it fun, it's diverse. It really, really keeps you thinking and on your toes. I've had some fights in this game which I have just been totally engrossed in, because you have to be paying so much attention. Some people may say that it's overwhelming, but the thing about games where the combat is overwhelming is I feel it's more like something you just have to practice. I think for a lot of people it may start off overwhelming, but the moment you really achieve the mastery of your powers and you understand what works best against what, you'll quickly find yourself overwhelming your opponent. I mean, I haven't even really mentioned the ranged attacks here. You do have a bow and arrow or even a throwing axe depending on what you've equipped, so you can strike enemies from a range, and whenever you do this it goes into slow motion, which I think was actually necessary because there's no way you could have accurately aimed in the mid of combat while everyone's swinging axes at you. And when you take out, say, 15 guys at once by just headshotting them, it can seem like it's an overpowered approach, but you are limited in terms of your ammo, and it does, funnily enough, balance out. What I haven't mentioned yet are the Captain Orcs and the War Chief Orcs and the Overlord Orcs. So these are more powerful versions of the standard Orcs, which are almost RPG-esque in terms of how you have to approach them. And they are incredibly dynamic, absolutely shockingly dynamic how crazy they are. So they're randomly generated, with an exception of a few that have to be as they are for the story to work. They all have personalities, and every time you go to fight them, you actually have a little intro. Although I will say those intros can get annoying when you get one after the other and you can't skip them, but still, it's great for building up personality for what you're fighting. And they all have something unique that you have to know about them. They might have a strength and a weakness. Some of them are really afraid of flies, for example. So if you were to shoot a beehive down, or it's they're not bees, but you know, it's the Lord of the Rings equivalent of wasps or whatever they are, and then they'll get terrified of them, and if they're terrified, they'll run away, and they can be easy prey. On the other hand, they might have some kind of advantage against you, so they might be arrow proof, so you try and shoot them, but your arrows don't work, so you have to go into melee combat. They even have this ability to adapt. So say you keep hitting your enemy in the back with a stun or something like that, they'll adapt to it so you can't use it anymore. That's a really clever system, but I will criticise it in one respect. There are some orcs that have so much health that I've had it where they have adapted to every one of my attacks, and I've basically just had to say, well, I can't hurt you anymore, you've adapted to everything. So I had to run away. I had no choice. I'd done everything. I'd arrowed them in the head, I'd stunned them, I'd thrown knives at them, I'd slashed them, I'd grabbed them, it was crazy. I just couldn't kill it. But then again, this is why you need to do your prep work, because you can gather intel on these captains which will highlight their weaknesses and their strengths. And I think for some orcs you just have to know their weakness to defeat them because they're so tough. So if you ever find yourself losing to captains quite a lot, just keep in mind that preparation. And they just present a fantastic way of making the combat even more varied than it already was. And I haven't even touched on the fact there is a stealth implementation into this game. It's not the most refined stealth, and it's certainly too forgiving, and you can move incredibly fast while in stealth, but it just gives you another way to approach combat, and it's something that again can be built on. So at the beginning of the game you can just sneak up to enemies and do a stealth attack, and by the end of the game you can stab one orc and then chain it to another orc with your wraith, and then another orc and another orc, and you can take out several orcs at once with attack. You can choose to, instead of doing a stealthy kill, you can sneak up behind them and brutalise them, and brutalising them will cause other enemies to run away in fear, so you've essentially terrified all the orcs by savaging one of them. And yet again, something else I haven't even touched on is the ability to dominate other orcs. So a big part of this game, which will lead me into the next part of this, is that you can mind control orcs, and basically they become yours in the midst of combat. So there are a few ways to do this. You can hold down the dominate button and capture them. You can use a combo ability to capture them. You can capture them from range. And once you've done this, the next thing depends on what they are. So if they are a mount, because you can dominate animals in this game, you will mount them. If they are a regular orc, or be it ranged, be it a big ogre orc, be it a shield orc, they will fight for you, right? They will defend you in battle, and they'll fight to the death for you. But if they're a captain orc, you can do a few different things, and this is really interesting. So you can either choose to, if memory serves me, you can recruit them into your main army, which will defend your fort. You can have them stay and fight for you. You can destroy their minds. You can mind warp them, I will say. In fact, I remember one of the orcs, it was kind of crazy. This guy came out of nowhere, and I actually felt quite frustrated, so I wanted to take it out on him. So I dominated him such a way that he lost his mind entirely. And the next time I saw him, he was basically crying, having a breakdown because I'd made him go deranged. It's quite amusing. So there's lots of things you can do with them while they're in this dominating state. And this will lead us on to the next bit, because you don't just dominate for one-off battles. You actually build up an entire army, and you then use this army to attack forts, and then you defend them in these siege battles. And these are, I think, probably the selling point of the game. At the first stages of the game, you're capturing all the forts with your army. So your army would be comprised of your top picks of your captains, so your most powerful guardsmen, and you can augment them with certain war machinery like siege beasts or shieldmen, things like that. And then you eventually break into the city with your army. You capture various points around the siege fort, and then you go in and you take on the overlord of the fort, who's like the main chief. And then once you've done that, you capture the fort and it's yours. Something quite interesting you can do during that whole process as well is you can take orcs that you own and you can infiltrate them into the Overlord's War Chief Council. And if you manage to capture every single appointment for War Chief, it actually allows you to pretty much take the fort with no effort, because when it comes to the battle itself, they've sabotaged everything. I've had it where I've just walked in and I've not fought a single orc because they've actually done it all for me. So if you put the time in and the investment, you can just make it a cakewalk. Although that is just a capturing part, you have to fight the Overlord mostly by yourself. You can bring a bodyguard, but on the whole it is a one-on-one fight. and these can be quite challenging. In fact, one of them was borderline like Dark Souls boss for me. And this won't be the same for everyone because, like I mentioned before, a lot of these orcs are randomly generated. Their abilities that are comboed together, the way they look, it's all random. And so I found myself fighting an overlord which had the ability to spawn in ranged units while also using heavy range himself, and also call in these banners which would over berserk his units. And I just found myself in this situation where I was dodging so many arrows and spears that I actually had no time to strike, and it was an exceptionally difficult fight, but when I did beat it, it was immensely satisfying to do. And of course, when you beat him, you can execute him, but I could have also made him go deranged, you know, if I felt like I had been so annoyed by the fight. But the thing is, if you dominate orcs, the downside is you don't get the loot that they drop, because there is a loot system in this game. I know it's just so massive, where like a game like Destiny or really any RPG, you gain items which make you stronger. So you'll get a new chest plate, a new cloak, a new sword, a new bow and arrow, and you get statistical bonuses, but also some interesting little bonuses like, for example, I had a cloak which meant that if I killed an enemy, there was a 22% chance it would make an explosion. So it's not just stats, it's also cool little things like that. And it's just a very vast game, and I certainly would not hold it against a game that it has so much in it, because it just means that it's really worth your money. And what happens in the one of the acts of the game, the act that I'm finding myself coming to the end of now, is that it's basically you've moved away from the story and it's just siege after siege battle. And if you found the mechanic to be underwhelming by this point, you probably won't finish the game, because it means you have to take something like... actually, I don't know the number in total, but you have to do a lot of siege battles. I really enjoyed it because the captains and the war chiefs and the overlords, they represent such a dynamic system within the game where it's different every time, that it means that even if you're going for the same siege battle in the same location, it won't necessarily be the same experience. Yes, it is similar, but it's not identical, so it's worth doing several times. So, on the whole, in terms of the game and what it gives you, there's a lot to get into when it comes to the gameplay. It is an immensely satisfying game with a lot of variety. I'll also briefly touch on the graphics. I'm playing the game on PC, and I want to call this a very well optimized game personally. I've got a pretty decent PC, so I have jacked up the settings pretty high. I've got 60 FPS, Ultra, 1440p, and it looks lovely. When I say that a game is well optimized, there are a few little things I tend to look for. I tend to look for frame pacing issues or inconsistencies in the frame rate. Essentially, that's it basically. And there was none of that. You know, this game is something that I thought would really have to be run at 30 FPS lock on my PC. But it is surprisingly well optimized, and it's pretty decent looking. Compared to Shadow of Mordor, I think maybe Shadow of Mordor had a slightly more sophisticated lighting system, but in this game, to be fair, it has to deal with these massive siege battles with way more enemies on screen, so fair enough if they had to make some concessions, but on the whole, it's a very good looking game. I mean, it's certainly one of its strengths, the graphics of this game. And, I mean, it is a good PC port. I mean, that's something we shouldn't take for granted. If anyone recalls the dark days of 2015, I believe it was 2015, when we had the Batman Arkham Knight game came out for PC, it was an abysmal port. So whenever I find a game like this by, I think, the same publisher, and it's a good port, good, they're improving. This is very nice, you know, I appreciate it. I really enjoy a good PC port. So that's the main part of the review. And I think I don't really like to score games anymore. I just think it's such an arbitrary system now that I really think about it. But let's say 8.5 territory. That's what we're talking. It's a good game, but it's not got like an amazing story, and that's what would have elevated it to like your 9s, maybe even perfect score territory. It gets that score for having a fantastic sandbox, lots of combat variety, and this really great system, the Nemesis system as I think it's officially called, where you get to build up your army, attack forts and defend your forts. So that's the main bit. Now let's talk about the microtransactions. Oh, Oh, this is scary. So let's just headline this right now. You do not need to spend any money to enjoy this game, and you don't need to spend any more money. Yeah, I should say any more money. Obviously, you have to buy the game, but you don't need to spend any more money to finish the game. You don't have to spend any to enjoy it. It can be totally ignored. And not only can it be totally ignored, it's actually baffling as to why anyone would use it, and more baffling still that it was implemented. So this isn't me defending their implementation, by the way. This is one of the most monumental PR mistakes I have seen in a long time. This is, this is borderline Xbox One launch level of mistake, because what they've done here is a lose-lose scenario for their game. Because, like I say, you genuinely do not need the microtransaction system. And to be honest, before I go on a rant, let me explain how it's implemented into the game. So, as I've told you, you have orcs in the game, and they vary in terms of power. You can level them up. You've got regular captain orcs, then you've got epic, and you've got legendary. And you have these loot boxes, which do feel a bit out of place. Now, loot boxes come in the variety of being purchased with in-game currency, so currency you earn from doing quests, from killing, from challenges, basically all sorts of things. So it's easily paid for just by playing the game. But there's also the currency of gold, which can be purchased with actual real-world money. And so with gold, you can use it to buy loot boxes which can contain legendary orcs. And legendary orcs, you know what, they're a bit of a bonus to have in your siege defense, but they're absolutely not critical. You don't need them. So you have regular orcs, epic orcs, and legendary orcs. And from my significant experience in the meta game of Shadow of War, epic orcs are very good for defending your siege. In fact, they pretty much can hold their own. I've never felt the need to go up to a legendary orc. If I manage to recruit one myself, that's fantastic. I've got a legendary orc, nice. But I really don't see the need to get one from one of these loot boxes. I mean, it's not necessary. It really is not. In fact, if you have a full set of epic captains, or epic war chiefs I should say, defending your siege battle, you are almost certainly going to win if they've been leveled up correctly. Legendary orcs would be overkill. You can totally play this game through without spending any money on it. And that really leaves me in a very confused state, because what they've done here is they've put a system into the game which has annoyed so many followers of this series, or just gamers in general, people who are sick of the practice. To the extent where if you look at the Metacritic score, at least at the moment, on the user side I should say, it is abysmal, as if this is a terrible game. Because people, quite rightfully so, disagree with this, because why should anyone spend so much money on a game? Because games are expensive these days, and then spend more money on the game. And if it was something that you had to do to get to the end of the game, I would be sitting here saying don't get Shadow of War. But it's not. It isn't even necessary. It is entirely superfluous. It's baffling as to why anyone would actually buy it. So this is just lose-lose, because what this will result in is this horrible PR situation that Warner Bros. Have found themselves in, and have really tarnished also the reputation of the series, because this is something that will not leave the series, as people think of it now as, remember Shadow of War, that game that was pay to win and had microtransactions and loot boxes. They won't think of it as this game which had a fantastic nemesis system. They ruined that, and because it's superfluous, it's not even necessary. They won't even make any money off it, because I can't fathom why anyone in their right mind would spend real money on this game. It really would boggle the mind if there's even 1% of the user base that spend a single penny on this, because you just don't need it. There's not even points where I thought, oh, I think this has been engineered in such a way that I'm encouraged to spend money. It never even got that hard. It's not a difficult game, As long as you do the preparation and you get the loot boxes that are bought with Miriam, which, as I have to emphasise, can be got with in-game currency and not excessively so. I've been playing the game quite a lot, I'll say, but I've had to do it around my job, and it only came out last Tuesday, I think. So I've not been playing this game that long, and I've almost completed Shadow Wars, so clearly it's not an integral thing. And I just see it as a shame. it's a massive, massive shame because they've destroyed the reputation of their game needlessly. They're not even getting anything out of it, presumably, because I don't see anyone spending any money on it. Like, at least with a mobile game that's free to play, you usually get in maybe a few hours and then it becomes very clear that to get anywhere with it, you have to spend real money. You never get to that point with this game. You never get to the point where you think, maybe I should spend real money on it. Although, and this is something I must not forget because this is a little bit of a caveat to it, there is this ability, if you choose to, which is entirely a side thing, to attack other players' forts. So you can take your army against their army. And it kind of cheapens that because the thing is, you never know if they bought their army with real money. And I don't know about anyone else, but when I play against someone who spent real money in a game to get ahead, I find it inherently unfair and not fun and not competitive at all. I think it totally destroys the competitive nature of a game if you introduce that. And so I actually have no interest whatsoever in exploring that as a game mode. So, okay, that aspect of the game for me personally is actually entirely forgettable because I feel like this system has ruined that. But this game feels entirely 100% complete even if you put that to one side, because really, yeah, you're fighting someone else's setup, but it doesn't really mean anything. It doesn't really matter that another player has acquired those orcs. They're still the random orcs you'd fight anyway. It's kind of a token effort, if anything. So, okay, that part is affected, and that's a shame, but that does not destroy the experience overall. And that's what I mean. It fundamentally comes down to a terrible, terrible marketing decision by some guy who, you know, I don't wish it upon anyone, but I would not be surprised if the people involved in making this decision have been fired from their position because of the damage it has done against the game, much like Dom Matrick, I think his name was Dom Matrick, was basically removed as the main PR guy for Microsoft when the Xbox One had that massive bomb. And I am referring to that because that is the level of horrific mistake, because this is a good game. This is a really enjoyable game that I would wholeheartedly recommend to any fan of this genre or any Lord of the Rings fan. So that's my review for Middle-earth: Shadow of War. Thank you very much for watching and see you next time.